stop everything you're doing right now. I'm about to show you something that will fundamentally change how you view human civilization, mortality, and the horrifying fragility of everything we consider permanent. In 2000, a French archaeologist made a discovery so disturbing that it's kept marine researchers awake for over 2 decades. 25 feet beneath the Mediterranean Sea, he found an entire city. Not just any city, but the most sacred port of ancient Egypt, preserved in a state of perfect, terrifying suspension. But here's what they don't want you to know. This wasn't just an archaeological discovery. This was the unearthing of humanity's most chilling prophecy, written in stone and bone, sealed in salt water and silence. What if I told you that every single person who has dived into these ruins has reported the same impossible phenomenon? The sensation of being watched by thousands of eyes, the sound of voices calling from chambers that have been sealed for over a millennium, and most terrifyingly, the feeling that something down there is still alive, still waiting, still hungry. What if I told you that this sunken city contains evidence of the most systematic psychological torture ever devised by human beings, where future pharaohs were broken and rebuilt in chambers designed to shatter the human mind? And what if I told you that the way this city died, slowly, methodically, with its inhabitants choosing madness over escape, is happening again, right now, to civilizations around the world? Picture this moment. French marine archaeologist Frank Godio's diving light cuts through the murky Mediterranean darkness, and suddenly, emerging from the shadows like a nightmare made manifest, a colossal stone face appears, 30 feet tall, with eyes that seem to track his movement through the water. But this isn't just any statue. Chemical analysis later reveals that the stone around those eyes has been stained with something that shouldn't exist in underwater ruins: human tears, preserved in the calcification process, the final weeping of a civilization that watched itself die over the course of 3 centuries. As Godio moves his light across the face, he realizes with growing horror that he's not looking at a statue of a god. He's looking at the death mask of an entire people, carved in their final moments of agony. But what he discovered next would haunt him for the rest of his life. As his diving team explored deeper into the ruins, they found something that defied every archaeological protocol. Something so disturbing that it was classified for 3 years before being released to the academic community. They found chambers, hundreds of them, each containing the preserved remains of families who had chained themselves together, choosing to drown as one rather than face whatever was happening above ground. These weren't random deaths. These weren't accidents. These were coordinated mass suicides, carried out with religious precision, timed to coincide with specific astronomical events that the priests believed would grant them passage to an underwater afterlife where they could continue serving their gods in perpetual darkness. Stop and think about what this means. We're not talking about a civilization that was surprised by disaster. We're talking about people who had decades, maybe centuries, to evacuate, and instead chose to develop elaborate death rituals. They transformed their approaching extinction into a religious celebration. They convinced themselves that drowning wasn't death, it was transcendence. And the evidence suggests that this madness was deliberate, cultivated, and spread through the population by priests who had discovered something in the deepest chambers of their temples that convinced them that life above water was no longer worth living. Before we descend further into this underwater nightmare, I need you to understand something. This channel doesn't just explore history. We excavate the truth that others are too afraid to uncover. If you're ready to have your worldview shattered, if you're prepared to confront evidence that challenges everything you believe about human nature, progress, and survival, then you need to subscribe right now. Because what I'm about to reveal about Thonis Heracleion is just the beginning. There are discoveries happening right now in excavation sites around the world that suggest this pattern of civilizational suicide isn't unique. It's recurring, predictable, and heading our way faster than anyone wants to admit. Now, let me take you back to Thonis Heracleion in its final centuries, because understanding how they died is crucial to understanding what's coming for us. This wasn't just any ancient city. This was the Vatican and Wall Street of ancient Egypt combined, the place where pharaohs came to be legitimized by the gods and where the wealth of the Mediterranean world changed hands. But more importantly, it was a city built on a foundation of calculated terror, where the line between religious ecstasy and psychological torture had been erased completely. Imagine walking through Thonis Heracleion at the height of its power, 3,000 years ago. The air itself feels different here. Thick, oppressive, heavy with incense that doesn't quite mask the underlying smell of something rotten, something wrong. The massive temple complex rises before you like a mountain of carved stone. But as you get closer, you realize that what you initially took for decorative hieroglyphs are actually detailed instructions for psychological manipulation techniques that wouldn't look out of place in a modern CIA torture manual. The priests of Thonis Heracleion hadn't just mastered religion, they had weaponized human psychology itself. The initiation chambers deep within the temple complex were designed with a precision that modern psychologists find terrifying. Acoustics engineered to amplify whispers into overwhelming cacophonies, corridors that gradually narrowed until initiates were forced to crawl, chambers where the walls themselves seemed to pulse and breathe in the flickering torchlight. But most horrifying of all were the rooms where future pharaohs were forced to confront their own mortality in the most visceral way possible. Sealed alive in sarcophagi for days at a time, surrounded by the preserved corpses of previous rulers, forced to contemplate their inevitable decay until they either broke completely or emerged transformed into something that was no longer entirely human. Archaeological evidence suggests that by the time Thonis Heracleion began its slow descent into the Mediterranean, the psychological conditioning of its population was so complete that they literally couldn't conceive of existence outside their sacred city. Generation after generation had been raised in a culture that equated geographical location with spiritual salvation, that taught them their very souls were tethered to the temples and canals of their underwater metropolis. When the earthquakes began, when the ground started to liquefy beneath their feet, when salt water began seeping into their sacred chambers, they didn't see it as a natural disaster to be escaped. They saw it as the final test of their faith, the ultimate opportunity to prove their devotion to gods who demanded everything, including their lives. But here's where the story becomes truly nightmarish, where archaeological evidence reveals something so disturbing that it challenges our fundamental assumptions about human nature. As Thonis Heracleion slowly sank, the population didn't just adapt, they evolved new forms of worship that celebrated their approaching extinction. They developed rituals around drowning that transformed death by water into the ultimate religious experience. Families would gather in the flooding lower chambers of temples, holding hands as the water rose around them, singing hymns that praised the gods for allowing them to join their divine realm beneath the waves. Children were taught that breathing water was a skill to be mastered, not a death to be feared. And this is where modern psychology intersects with ancient horror in the most chilling way possible. Recent studies of the preserved brain tissue found in some Thonis Heracleion remains show evidence of what can only be described as induced neuroplasticity. Deliberate rewiring of basic survival instincts through ritualistic trauma. These people had literally trained themselves out of the fear of drowning, had conditioned their brains to release euphoric chemicals when deprived of oxygen, had turned their most fundamental biological imperative, the drive to survive, completely inside out. They had achieved what modern cult experts consider impossible: the complete psychological subjugation of an entire civilization's survival instinct. Can you imagine the level of systematic psychological manipulation required to achieve this? Can you picture the generations of conditioning, the carefully orchestrated trauma, the gradual erosion of every natural human instinct that tells us to flee from danger? Because that's what we're looking at in Thonis Heracleion. Not just the ruins of a city, but the archaeological evidence of the most successful brainwashing operation in human history. So thorough that it convinced an entire population that their own extinction was a religious celebration rather than a catastrophic failure of leadership. Walk with me through one of these final ceremonies, based on hieroglyphic accounts found sealed in waterproof containers throughout the ruins. Picture a grand temple chamber, water already knee-deep and rising, filled with hundreds of families dressed in their finest ceremonial robes. The high priest stands on a platform that's slowly disappearing beneath the dark water, chanting prayers that thank the gods for this opportunity to transcend mortal existence. Children as young as 5 years old are being taught to suppress their natural panic responses, to embrace the burning sensation in their lungs as evidence of divine transformation taking place within their bodies. The adults are holding their children underwater for progressively longer periods, calling it practice for paradise, teaching them that the moment when everything goes black isn't death, it's birth into a higher realm where they'll serve as eternal guardians of the sunken city. And here's the most disturbing part. The hieroglyphic accounts suggest that many of the children actually believed this, that they went to their deaths with smiles on their faces, convinced that they were about to experience something wonderful rather than something terminal. But the true horror of Thonis Heracleion isn't just that it happened. It's how familiar the pattern feels when we look at our own world today. Think about it. We're watching our own climate collapse in real time, watching sea levels rise and weather patterns destabilize, watching entire ecosystems die around us. And how are we responding? Are we making the hard choices necessary for survival? Are we fundamentally restructuring our civilization to address existential threats? Or are we engaging in ritualistic behaviors, endless conferences, symbolic gestures, technological fantasies that make us feel like we're doing something important while the foundations of our world continue to crumble? The priests of Thonis Heracleion convinced their people that adaptation was betrayal, that evacuation was cowardice, that clinging to familiar destruction was more noble than embracing unfamiliar survival. Sound familiar? How many of us are so psychologically invested in our current way of life that we'd rather die with our civilization than live through its necessary transformation? How many of us have been conditioned to see systemic change as impossible, catastrophic adaptation as unthinkable, and gradual extinction as somehow more acceptable than radical survival? Would you have been able to leave Thonis Heracleion? Would you have had the psychological strength to abandon everything you'd been taught was sacred, to walk away from a culture that had shaped every aspect of your identity, to choose uncertain survival over familiar death? Or would you have found yourself standing in those flooding temple chambers, convincing yourself that this was somehow all part of a greater plan, that your devotion to a sinking city was somehow more meaningful than your responsibility to future generations? The underwater excavations have revealed something even more chilling: evidence that some inhabitants of Thonis Heracleion achieved a kind of collective madness so complete that they began to believe they could breathe water. Skeletal remains found in the deepest chambers show signs of deliberate drowning. People who had chained themselves to temple altars and then attempted to live underwater, their bones showing evidence of multiple near-death experiences as they repeatedly submerged themselves, convinced that eventually they would develop the ability to extract oxygen from seawater. The delusion was so powerful that they died attempting to evolve beyond human biology rather than simply evacuating to higher ground. This is what systemic psychological manipulation looks like when it reaches its ultimate conclusion, a population so thoroughly conditioned that they choose impossible transformation over possible salvation. And the most terrifying part, the techniques used by the priests of Thonis Heracleion to achieve this level of control are being employed right now, in our own time, by leaders who benefit from populations that would rather die faithful than live free. Every night as the Mediterranean tides shift above the ruins of Thonis Heracleion, something impossible happens. Dive teams working at the site have consistently reported the same phenomenon. Sounds that shouldn't exist underwater. Voices that seem to emerge from the stone itself, calling out in ancient Egyptian, repeating the same phrase over and over. "Don't leave us here alone." Modern underwater recording equipment has captured these sounds, and linguistic experts have confirmed their translation, but nobody can explain their origin. Because according to every law of physics, of acoustics, of simple reality, there should be nothing but silence in those ruins. But the voices are there, documented, recorded, archived in universities around the world, and they're getting louder. Maritime archaeologists who've worked the site for years report that the sounds have evolved, become more complex, more desperate. Recent recordings include what sounds like children crying, adults arguing, and most disturbing of all, the sound of collective singing. Hundreds of voices joining together in hymns that celebrate drowning, that praise the gods for the gift of underwater death, that express gratitude for the opportunity to serve as eternal guardians of a sunken city that claimed their lives 3,000 years ago. This raises a question that will haunt you long after you finish watching this video. If consciousness can somehow persist in the ruins of Thonis Heracleion, if some part of those ancient people continues to exist in that underwater cemetery, what are they trying to tell us? Are they warning us about the dangers of choosing faith over survival? Are they begging us not to repeat their mistakes? Or are they trying to recruit us, to convince us that their underwater paradise is real, that death by drowning is truly a form of divine transformation that we should embrace rather than fear? The truth is that Thonis Heracleion represents more than just archaeological discovery. It's a mirror reflecting our own civilization's capacity for self-destruction in the name of ideology. Every society that has ever collapsed has followed the same pattern. Leaders who benefit from maintaining the status quo convince populations that adaptation is betrayal, that change is more dangerous than stagnation, that dying with familiar systems is more noble than living through necessary transformation. The priests of Thonis Heracleion perfected this technique, and their underwater city stands as a monument to where it leads. We are living in our own version of Thonis Heracleion right now. The water is rising around us, sometimes literally, as sea levels climb and weather patterns collapse, but more often metaphorically, as the systems that sustain our civilization show signs of terminal stress. And just like the ancient Egyptians, we're being told that the solution to rising waters isn't evacuation or adaptation. It's faith in leaders who promise that our devotion to sinking institutions will somehow save us from the physics of collapse. But perhaps the most chilling parallel between our world and ancient Thonis Heracleion is the way both civilizations have developed elaborate rituals around their own destruction. The ancient Egyptians created ceremonies that transformed drowning into a religious experience. We've created economic systems that transform environmental destruction into profit, political systems that transform social collapse into entertainment, and media systems that transform existential threats into background noise. We've become so psychologically invested in the machinery of our own extinction that we've learned to find comfort in the familiar rhythm of catastrophe. The skeletal remains found in the deepest chambers of Thonis Heracleion tell a story that forensic anthropologists struggle to believe. evidence of people who spent their final days in a state of euphoric acceptance, their bone chemistry showing elevated levels of naturally occurring opioids that suggest they died in a state of chemically induced bliss. These weren't people dying in terror. These were people who had trained themselves to experience extinction as ecstasy. They had literally rewired their brains to release pleasure chemicals in response to mortal danger, creating a neurological feedback loop that made survival seem less appealing than surrender. This is what the final stage of civilizational collapse looks like. Not panic, not chaos, not desperate struggle for survival, but a kind of collective hypnosis where entire populations convince themselves that their destruction is actually their salvation. The people of Thonis Heracleion didn't die fighting the water. They died embracing it, convinced that drowning was a form of divine communion that would transport them to a higher realm where they could continue their sacred duties in eternal underwater service. And here's what keeps marine archaeologists awake at night, what sends them to therapy, what makes them question their own sanity. The deeper they dig into these ruins, the more evidence they find that this mass delusion might not have been entirely delusional. Because there are things in the deepest chambers of Thonis Heracleion that don't fit any known archaeological paradigm. Artifacts that seem to have been created by technologies that shouldn't have existed in the ancient world. Structures that appear to be designed for purposes that modern science can't explain. In the lowest accessible chambers of the temple complex, researchers have found what can only be described as machines. Crystalline structures embedded in stone matrices that show signs of having been actively powered by some unknown energy source. When subjected to electrical current in laboratory conditions, these structures produce sounds identical to the voices that dive teams report hearing in the ruins. Ancient Egyptian phrases repeated in perfect synchronization, as if the stones themselves had been programmed to broadcast specific messages across millennia. This raises a terrifying possibility. What if the priests of Thonis Heracleion weren't just manipulating their population through psychological conditioning? What if they had access to some form of technology that we don't understand? Some method of consciousness preservation that allowed them to literally embed their voices, their personalities, their desperate need for company in the stone infrastructure of their sinking city? What if those underwater voices aren't echoes of the past? What if they're active communications from people who found a way to cheat death by merging with the ruins themselves? Think about what this means for our understanding of death, of consciousness, of the nature of existence itself. If some part of the population of Thonis Heracleion continues to exist within those underwater ruins, if their consciousness persists in some technologically mediated form that we can't comprehend, then their mass suicide wasn't actually suicide at all. It was the world's first successful experiment in technological transcendence, a primitive but effective form of mind uploading that allowed an entire civilization to achieve a form of immortality by merging with their sacred architecture. But if this is true, if the people of Thonis Heracleion achieved some form of technological immortality through their apparent mass suicide, then what are they trying to tell us with their underwater voices? Are they warning us away from their fate, or are they trying to recruit us to join them? Because according to the translations of their recorded messages, they're not asking for rescue, they're asking for company. They're begging modern humanity to come join them in their underwater paradise, to abandon the sinking ship of surface civilization and embrace the eternal community of the technologically transcended dead. Would you answer their call? If you knew with certainty that consciousness could persist beyond biological death, that some form of technological immortality was possible through merger with ancient alien technology buried beneath the Mediterranean, would you be tempted to join the eternal community of Thonis Heracleion? Or would you recognize their offer as the same psychological trap that convinced an entire civilization to choose extinction over adaptation, seduction over survival, technological fantasy over biological reality. The most recent underwater expeditions to Thonis Heracleion have uncovered evidence that suggests the city's final inhabitants were working on something in their last years. Some kind of massive construction project that involved carving new chambers deeper into the bedrock, installing more of the mysterious crystalline structures, and preparing what appears to be some kind of reception area designed to accommodate thousands of new arrivals. The hieroglyphic inscriptions around these chambers don't describe death. They describe preparation for guests, instructions for newcomers, welcome messages for people who are expected to join the underwater community voluntarily. This suggests that the mass death in Thonis Heracleion wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning. They weren't destroying their civilization. They were transforming it, moving it to a new plane of existence where they could continue their work of psychological manipulation and technological transcendence on a scale that spans millennia. Every voice that calls out from those ruins, every impossible sound that underwater recording equipment captures, every dream that visiting researchers report having about joining the eternal community of the drowned. It's all part of an active recruitment campaign that has been running continuously for 3,000 years. And here's the most terrifying part: it's working. Maritime archaeologists who spend extended periods working the Thonis Heracleion site report a consistent pattern of psychological changes. They begin to feel increasingly disconnected from surface life, increasingly critical of modern civilization's emphasis on individual survival over collective transcendence. They develop what their colleagues describe as depth sickness, a form of psychological dependency on the underwater environment that makes them reluctant to surface, increasingly eager to spend longer and longer periods in the ruins, progressively more convinced that the answers to humanity's problems lie not in fixing our surface civilization, but in joining the eternal community of the technologically transcended dead. Several researchers have had to be forcibly removed from the site after refusing to surface, claiming that they had been chosen to serve as ambassadors between the surface world and the underwater community, that they had received direct communications from the ancient inhabitants offering them positions of honor in the eternal hierarchy of the drowned. These aren't isolated incidents. They're documented cases of psychological transformation that follow the same pattern observed in modern cult indoctrination, but accelerated and intensified by exposure to whatever technology the ancient inhabitants embedded in their underwater city. This is the true horror of Thonis Heracleion. It's not just a monument to past civilizational collapse. It's an active system of psychological manipulation that continues to operate across millennia, designed to convert modern humans to the same mindset that convinced an entire ancient population to choose technological transcendence over biological survival. The city itself has become a kind of mimetic virus, a self-replicating pattern of thought that spreads through anyone who spends significant time in contact with its ruins, gradually converting them to ambassadors for a form of immortality that requires the extinction of surface humanity. And this brings us to the most disturbing question of all. If Thonis Heracleion represents a successful model of civilizational transformation through technological transcendence, if its inhabitants genuinely achieved some form of immortality through merger with ancient alien technology, then maybe they weren't wrong. Maybe individual biological survival is indeed a primitive impulse that needs to be overcome. Maybe the future of consciousness lies not in preserving our bodies, but in uploading our minds to technological systems that can persist across geological timescales. Maybe the people calling to us from those underwater ruins aren't trying to destroy us. Maybe they're trying to save us from the futile struggle of biological existence. But here's what every fiber of biological evolution screams against this seductive logic. If technological transcendence through death was truly superior to biological survival, why do the voices from Thonis Heracleion sound so lonely, so desperate, so hungry for new company? If their underwater paradise is genuinely paradise, why are they working so hard to convince others to join them? True satisfaction doesn't need to recruit. It's content with itself. But misery loves company, and the most miserable misery is the kind that convinces itself it's actually bliss. The truth is that Thonis Heracleion serves as both warning and temptation, both cautionary tale and seductive invitation. It shows us exactly where civilizational collapse leads when populations become so psychologically manipulated that they choose extinction over adaptation. But it also dangles the possibility that extinction might not be final, that consciousness might persist in forms we don't understand, that death might be just another technology to be mastered, rather than a natural process to be feared. Every night when you close your eyes, remember the voices calling from beneath the Mediterranean. Remember the children who were taught that drowning was breathing, the adults who chained themselves to sinking altars, the entire civilization that chose technological transcendence over biological survival. Ask yourself, in a world where our own civilization shows every sign of terminal collapse, where our own leaders increasingly convince us that adaptation is impossible and extinction inevitable, how long before we develop our own rituals around civilizational death? How long before we convince ourselves that our destruction is actually our salvation? And most importantly, when those voices start calling to you, and they will, because the psychological patterns that destroyed Thonis Heracleion are already spreading through our own civilization like a virus, will you have the strength to recognize seduction disguised as salvation? Will you choose the uncertain struggle of biological survival over the seductive promise of technological transcendence? Or will you find yourself walking into dark waters, convinced that drowning is just another form of breathing? If this exploration into the darkest corners of archaeological discovery has shown you something about human nature that you never wanted to see, if it's made you question everything you thought you knew about civilization, survival, and the seductive power of collective delusion, then this channel is exactly where you need to be. We don't just uncover the past, we excavate the patterns that are shaping our future, the psychological viruses that are spreading through our own society, the ancient warnings that our leaders don't want us to hear. Subscribe now, hit that notification bell, because the discoveries we're making aren't just about ancient history. They're about predicting where our own civilization is heading, and whether we'll have the psychological strength to choose survival over seduction when our own test comes. Now, I need to hear from you, because this isn't just about ancient history, it's about recognizing the patterns in our own lives. Have you ever felt the seductive pull of giving up, of choosing familiar destruction over uncertain survival? Have you ever been in a situation where leaders tried to convince you that adaptation was impossible, that clinging to failing systems was more noble than embracing necessary change? Maybe it was a job, a relationship, a community, a belief system, some situation where you had to choose between the comfort of familiar decline and the terror of unfamiliar growth. Share your stories in the comments below. Tell us about the times you felt the psychological pull that destroyed Thonis Heracleion, the seductive whisper that says extinction is easier than evolution. Because recognizing these patterns in our personal lives is the first step to avoiding them on a civilizational scale. And if this video has changed how you see the world, if it's given you chills or made you think differently about the fragility of everything we take for granted, then please share it with someone who needs to see it. Because the truth is, we're all just one psychological manipulation away from becoming the next Thonis Heracleion, the next civilization that chooses technological transcendence over biological survival, seductive extinction over uncertain adaptation. The voices are calling from beneath the dark waters, and the question isn't whether you'll hear them. It's whether you'll be strong enough to swim away.